Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about communism, equality, and how it relates to Cuba and Nicaragua. So originally my paper was about how communism propels equality in these countries based on my prior knowledge of Cuba. And so I chose Cuba because of its close proximity to the US, and it's sort of the country I feel that we are always referencing when we're talking about communism, just because of how close it is to us, and it's sort of the country given as an example when we're learning about communism, which is usually learned about in a frowned upon way in our capitalist society. I originally chose Nicaragua because of its very rich history and sort of fluctuating political structures over the years. And based on my knowledge of Cuba, my original idea, which was about how equality has propelled in both of them, didn't really work out. I did some more research and found that Nicaragua doesn't have the same kind of equality that Cuba has, which we'll get into a little more, but I just wanted to tell you that now the premise of my project is comparing the two and showing how Cuba has thrived when it comes to equality from communism, but Nicaragua sort of hasn't had that same effect. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Just wanted to give a background of how I came to the countries that I decided to go over. So let's talk about what is communism. So I pulled a quote which says, "Communism is a political and economic ideology that positions itself in opposition to liberal democracy and capitalism, advocating instead a classless system in which the means of production are owned communally and private property is non-existent or severely curtailed." Communism, as you probably know, was created by Karl Marx. And when Castro took over Cuba, he put communism in place. A key word in here is classless system, which we'll get to classes a little bit later on. But that's essentially what Castro believed in. And Nicaragua was under a socialist rule during the Sandinista governance. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Cuba's political history. So Cuba gained independence from Spain in 1898. This was during the Spanish-American War. In 1901, the Platt Amendment came about, which gave the U.S. the right to intervene in governments in the Cuban government for individual liberties. Machado became president in 1925 and was overthrown in 1933, and he ran with a dictatorship style. In 1934, President Roosevelt abrogates the Platt Amendment. In 1940, Batista was elected president. He was not re-elected, but then took over the government in 1952, and that began the dictatorship, which eventually Castro led some student rebels to try to overthrow. The rebels led by Castro attack military barracks and are jailed. Castro flees to Mexico. Eventually he comes back and takes over in 1959 and starts Cuba on its path to becoming a communist country. So Nicaragua's political history. Nicaragua became independent in 1821 from Spain. From 1926 to 1933, the Marines occupy Nicaragua. Sandino leads a guerrilla war. Sandino was assassinated in 1934 and then became the Anastasio Somoza dictatorship, which took place in 1936 to 1957. The Sandinista Socialist Revolution began in 1979 and the Sandinistas ruled from 1979 to 1990. They were socialists. One of their capstones was that they wanted better conditions for the poor in Nicaragua. Okay, so now I'm going to get to sort of the main point of my connection between communism and equality. So this quote is actually just from my paper, which says, "The basic root of communism is a classless political system in which everyone is equal. Leaders in this structure must put laws in place in order to make sure the basis of communism is being followed." My point in saying this is just to stress the fact that as opposed to a democratic or capitalist society, although it's seen as having more freedom, and so you can have any beliefs that you choose in this type of communist society where everyone is equal, actual laws are put in place to make sure there is no discrimination, and sentences and penalties are much higher for those who do practice discrimination. And so there are actual laws put in place for equality. The idea is that everyone will be at the same level, and although beliefs can't change, equality is enforced. So that being said, you can't change what people ultimately think, but within the society, laws are enforced so that negative attitudes toward people of a different race, gender, or class cannot be shown. So we'll talk about how communism protects racism, or doesn't protect racism, protects people from racism. Sorry. So in 1959, Castro condemned racial discrimination. He vowed equality for everyone in the workforce, labor pool, schools. He launched a literacy program which ensured that everyone got equal knowledge and knew how to read. And over the years of his rule, the number of Afro-Cubans in the state council doubled from 4 to 8. So this is where we're going to start seeing the comparison between Cuba and Nicaragua, and you can start to see how Nicaragua has had less progression. So in Nicaragua, there are claims of mistreatment of the Mosquito people, allegations of anti-Semitism, which said that there were attacks and arrests of the Jewish people, and also the confiscation of their items with no warrant. So that's how we start to see that maybe Nicaragua isn't making as many strides toward racial equality as Cuba has. So moving on to gender. During the Cuban Revolution, women were given many rights compared to the rest of Latin America. They were able to obtain the 1975 Cuban Family Code, which outlawed discrimination against women and girls, even in their own families. This is important because discrimination against women is already a great step towards progression, but the fact that even in their own families is important because within the family structure, it would be common for, of course, the women of the household to be unequal to the men. With this structure, even in the household, husbands and wives treated each other equally. Duties were equal, and no one was expected to do anything that the other person wasn't. So then, moving on to Nicaragua, during the Sandinista rule, some laws were very limiting for women. The Sandinista rule did not address abortion. It did not address domestic violence. It did not address equal rights among family members, equal pay, gay and lesbian rights. and abortion was still never decriminalized, according to Prevost and Vanden from the text. So, just to touch a little bit on some modern statistics, just to see where our countries stand now when it comes to gender inequality. And this is from Human Development Indicators. So, as we can see, both countries are declining, which is great, from 1995 on to 2017. Although Nicaragua's number is still quite high and not decreasing as rapidly as Cuba's. Cuba is still pretty far behind the U.S. I think the U.S. is around 0.189 or something around there. And of course, these numbers are decimals in the original data, but when I made the graphs, I made them whole numbers just so it was easier to see the difference. But it's clear to see that Cuba is still making slow and steady strides, whereas Nicaragua is still at a pretty high number, and actually their lowest number is still higher than Cuba's highest number. So that's just a little bit of a check-in on their modern statistics when it comes to gender inequality. So now we're going to move on to class. So this is dealing with different economic and social classes. So when Castro came into power, he nationalized middle and upper class owned land, companies, and businesses, including his own. All Cuban children were receiving education by the 1960s, no matter what their class was, and unemployment overall was reduced. In Nicaragua, in 1985, a study was done, and this is during the Sandinistas' rule, and at this time, over 60% of the population is poor, and the poverty rate was over 80% in rural areas, and this is all knowledge from the U.S. Library of Congress. So we can really see how Cuba was making strides toward equality in classes, while Nicaragua still had a lot of the population being poor, and these were even pretty low standards of poor. So we can see how Cuba is still sort of progressing more than Nicaragua in that way. Okay, so time to conclude. So my original hypothesis, which was that communism leads to greater equality, was not true. It works, as with anything, it works with some cases, and in some cases it doesn't. So my conclusion now is that communism and socialism have their flaws, but they can have their positives too. So to review a little bit, Cuba made strides toward progression during Castro's rule. Nicaragua did not show similar efforts toward racial equality, women's rights, or fixing the lower classes. Slow improvements do continue to be made in both countries, and so ultimately communist structure propels equality in Cuba due to their laws put in place. But ultimately, further investigation needs to be done on Nicaragua. So since my idea for this project was based mostly off of a prior knowledge of Cuba and knowing how communism has propelled equality for them, further investigation does need to be done for Nicaragua about if they would benefit from a different structure than they've had in the past, and just what can be done to improve their poverty rates. So that is everything I have. Thank you for your time and listening. And if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear it.